Dankosky just asked me how the mic worked. It's a good start.
It's a good start. Why are there so many cameras up? What is this with the risers and stuff?
This is the paparazzi. We have quite a thing. Oh my God, there's a live stream. Did we start the live stream yet? Oh, the live stream started. This is so exciting. Welcome to Real Artways. This is going to be the most exciting one of these things that we've done in a long time. Give me just a second to get my bearings straight. We're here and we're just starting on time, which never happens.
I did my best to slow us down.
Yeah, you tried like hell, but here we are still happening on time. So I'm John Dankosky. I work with the Connecticut Mirror. I work with Science Friday. I used to work for a radio station that Colin and Lisa work for. I'd like to welcome you to an event we're charmingly calling What Just Happened? It's meant to be a recap of last Tuesday's election. Coming up next week, just as by way of a little preview here, I'm host of a series that we do with the Connecticut Mirror called In the Room, and next Wednesday I'll be talking with Lieutenant Governor Susan Bysowitz at the Hartford Public Library. It proves to be at least as scintillating as tonight's event. More information there at connecticutmirror.org/events. I have to do one more little piece of business here because Bruce Putterman, the publisher of the Mirror, is here. I can't get away with this. Consider a donation to the Connecticut Mirror at ctmirror.org. There's something called Newsmatch, which is underway. Does anybody know what Newsmatch is? Okay, so Newsmatch means that gifts in support of the Mirror's nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism will be doubled between now and December 31st. But if you give before midnight tonight, this is what I read on the website. Do I have this right, Bruce? If you give before midnight tonight, your gift will be tripled because of very generous donors who have given extra money. So it sounds just like a public radio fundraiser, because it basically is, but for the Connecticut Mirror. So Newsmatch is underway, ctmirror.org. Hit the little donate button. So thank you for supporting our journalism. Also, thanks to Real Artways for hosting this event. Big round of applause for the folks at Real Artways. They have so many cool cultural events. Tomorrow night is the Riverwood Poetry Series. On Sunday, it's Joe Morris's Extraordinary Improvisations Now series, which features some of the great improvisers in the world, basically making something up out of thin air, which is what we're going to do right now for you. Because we've got a lot to get to in the next hour, let me introduce our guest. Mark Pazniokas is Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. Give it up for Mark Pazniokas. Lisa Hagen is federal policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public. Lisa Hagen. And Colin McEnroe is the host of the Colin McEnroe Show. He's a columnist for Hearst Connecticut newspapers, and he's the former co-host and co-founder of The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. Colin McEnroe. Okay, so here's the thing. There's a lot to talk about, but I kind of want to get like some of the vibes and the feels out of the way. Colin, I'm going to start with you. You've had like a week to think and reflect about what happened. How are you feeling right now, and what sorts of things are you thinking about now, 1 week after this election?
Well, I have been thinking a lot about this. To an untrained observer, it might seem like I was just watching Netflix and staring pretty intently at Kerry Russell, but that is not the case. I've really been thinking about this. No, I mean, first of all, I think it's going to take a lot more than a week. One thing that I would say, and it may be something that will be fun for us to talk about, fun is probably the wrong word, is that E.F. Schumacher would have said, first of all, your country's too big. That's one of your problems. Your country's too big. And a lot of things that will happen at a smaller level may be really important. I think it's more important than ever who's governor of Connecticut. I think it's more important what people do in their states and their localities. A lot of that, obviously, is, Mordor is going to cast a long shadow over that. But I think thinking really intentionally about who we are, in the state of Connecticut, in the city of Hartford, in Winstead, obviously, it's, you have to share your space with a lot of sheep, but
Actually, bears.
bears and sheep.
We had 4 bears in my yard on election day.
So I guess I've been thinking a lot about that. If things start to dysfunction, if there are assaults on things like Affordable Care Act or Medicaid, things like that, we may have to be thinking about playing small ball and inventing solutions at a state and local level. That's way more profound sounding than what I've really actually been thinking about, which is kind of Kerry Russell, but it'll have to do.
I will tell you, instead of staying up and watching election returns all night that night, I actually binged the entire season of The Diplomat.
It's really good.
I watched the whole thing, just one after another. But Colin, you wrote a really beautiful post-election column about this, about, talking with the people in your neighborhood, thinking about how you talk with people who maybe think differently about you. Playing small ball, as you say, requires talking through some of these differences with people one-on-one. That's been kind of hard over the course of the last several years. Is there something about what just happened that might make that easier, or is it harder again?
It's probably going to be both under different circumstances, but yeah, just really quickly, I do this, I walk my dog with the same informal kind of clump of people every day, like 7 days a week. There are people there that I see 7 days a week. And there's this couple who are a little bit older than me, and that's, increasingly a smaller demographic, people who are older than me. But I really kind of admire the way that they're physically active, they're culturally active, they're really like super engaged with life around Hartford. And I don't know, there was all this kind of awkwardness on Wednesday after the election, and finally somebody said to me, well, they're Trump voters, and that thought had not really crossed my mind. And I got a little bit more information about it, but people were kind of avoiding each other a little bit, people who would ordinarily be talking to each other. And I finally ran into them and their dogs, and they were wrapping up what seemed like kind of a tense conversation with somebody else that I know. And dogs were coming up to the woman, and she just looked at me with this rather pained expression and said, she pointed to the dogs and she said, they don't want to talk politics. Which is true for most of the dogs. But, and I just, look, one of the things that's sort of hard for us to grasp is that if you're a Trump voter in Connecticut, you're hiding a lot of the time. You're not talking because you are in a minority, and a minority that often excites a certain amount of anger, resentment, and even belligerence from the majority. And I just carrying that idea around a little bit and realizing that there are things that I value about these two people. They've made some choices. I think a lot of their choices might have to do, I don't really know this, with being opposed to abortion, believing that it is in fact the taking of a human life, and being unable to just reconcile voting for Kamala Harris with what they believe. And that's what they believe. They don't believe that because they're evil. It's what they believe. They were brought up in a religious tradition or whatever. And I do think we might have to get past this a little bit. People don't always believe what we believe. That doesn't necessarily make them monsters. And somehow or other, we're going to have to find a way to share not only this nation, but Connecticut and Hartford and places where we're really close to one another. So I don't know. I haven't really gone further than that, other than to kind of just palpate that a little bit.
But that's a good place to walk it up to. So Lisa, how about you? What are the things that you have been thinking about as you analyze what happened over the course of that entire election, and what really has come of this last week?
Yeah, a lot is going through my mind. I thought it was going to be a longer, drawn-out period. I just thought that it was we weren't going to know what was going to happen that night, early that morning, and so seeing definitive results come out pretty quickly, I think, is pretty striking. And, as someone who's based in Washington, D.C., Congress is coming back. They came back today, and so now they're going to have to reckon with the fact that they have a month and a half to do whatever they need to do to get done in a current Democratic administration, and then grapple with the fact that it's probably going to be uniform control. As of right now, we don't know who has the House, but for a state like Connecticut, where it is across the board, Democratic office holders, and including in the congressional delegation, they're going to be back in the minority, and I'm kind of waiting to see what kind of role do they play, because we've had members of our delegation play big roles in bipartisan negotiations. But now that it's likely uniform control, are there going to be negotiations? Are there going to be people playing ball? Republicans are going to be able to run the table, and so I'm curious to see what role the delegation plays, and if they're just basically playing backstop for the next at least 2 years.
I should ask you, though, in a sort of a personal question along the lines of what Colin's talking about with his dog walking group. I mean, you live in Washington, D.C. Man, D.C. changes a lot in a couple weeks. Like, it's just a different town. There's a whole bunch of different people working there, and there's a different vibe. Have you been living in D.C. during one of these transitions between a Democratic administration and a Republican administration and just see what it's like to, like, just be with people?
Yeah, no, I've been through it when they've had, different administrations come through. And I mean, it's a lot for a company town like DC, because it's a lot of federal workers and it's a lot of people who are going to lose their jobs come, January. And so I'm a little jealous right now. I'm not in DC currently, and I'm curious to feel the vibe that's currently happening in DC. I imagine it's Democrats a little bit maybe with their hair on fire, trying to figure out how to, figure out their place in Washington come January, and then Republicans who are, about to, again, run the table. So.
But this is one thing, Colin, I'll just quickly say that it's different here than it is in Washington, D.C., because here in Connecticut, you actually literally can have a life in which you can say, what's happening at Roll Our Ways? Let's go talk about that movie. Let's talk about what happened. Let's go to the symphony orchestra. But in D.C., you only ever talk about politics. Like, you can't get out of it, and that's one of the pieces of dysfunction about that particular town. So I don't know, Colin, it feels good to live in a place where it's not all about that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the staff of my show, we had a long meeting on Monday just to talk about what we were going to do because we intentionally really leaned into not exactly political coverage, but looking at the election from some unusual perspectives and just focusing on stuff in our usual eccentric way. And we kind of agreed that we're not forsaking that, we're not stopping that, but we need to dial it back. We need to bring the rest of life in. Otherwise, it'll be like we're living in D.C.
Yeah, and so, okay, we're talking about bringing the rest of life in, but here I have the Capitol Bureau Chief, Mark Pazniokas, who lives and breathes politics, and I guess I'm wondering what you're thinking about this week, Paz.
I'm thinking about how Colin has been very open about the fact that he's been in therapy for quite a while, and he framed this, it really sounded like he was going to ask you all to hold hands. And that is, let's sort of confront what is different about these times. If this was a Mitt Romney who had won or a John McCain, I don't think this event would have been titled as it was, and I don't think Colin would have framed it the way he did about the importance of acknowledging political differences. It does make it somewhat awkward for me, who is, Colin is an opinion writer. Colin, it's all on his sleeve, which I enjoy greatly, not just about politics, but about a lot of things in his life. And the whole construct of how we're starting this, I'm almost like a little bit uncomfortable about, because it's almost an assumption that everybody here is freaked out. And I'm guessing, given the demographics of who might come to an event like this, that's probably true. So that is one of the things I just wanted to throw out there, because it is a different time. It is. I covered the Democratic National Convention as well as the Republican one, and there was a vibe in Chicago that was so different because Donald Trump was the opponent. There was this sense of this existential threat. There was this sense of great relief that Joe Biden had stepped aside and made way for Kamala Harris. Obviously, in hindsight, I think people might recognize it would have been better if he had done that a year earlier, and there was a full and open primary that would have tested an opponent and vetted them and would find out more about their positions on things other than the fact they're not Donald Trump.
One of the things that Colin was talking about is the sense that in Connecticut, if you were a Trump voter before Tuesday, and maybe even now in some circles, you'd hide because it's such a blue state.
Well, assuming your name is not Joe Visconti.
Yeah, just who's probably here tonight. But that's a little less true, Paz, than it has been in the past, right? There was a big movement in urban areas in a lot of towns in Connecticut toward Trump. It doesn't mean that he won these towns, but it means that there was a big wave in that direction in a lot of Connecticut.
There was. There was and there wasn't. So we don't have really the final numbers. These things will change a little bit. But it looks like Kamala Harris won Connecticut by about 14 points, which is the same that Hillary Clinton won Connecticut, in 2016. Joe Biden, it was more like 20. We can analyze that any number of ways. But one of the things I noticed looking at the numbers is that in some places Trump did do better. In a lot of places, the difference in the percentages is the Democratic turnout. There were a lot of people who just stayed home. And it was really stunning in the cities. Bridgeport, there were 9,000 fewer votes cast for president than there was 4 years ago. Yeah. And in Hartford, New Haven, off by 5,000. In some of the larger suburbs that are also very important to Democrats in this state, the ones like West Hartford, Fairfield, Hamden, all around 60,000 people. The Trump vote really didn't move, but the Democratic vote came down a little bit, even in those places.
And that's true nationwide, too. I mean, Phil Bump and somebody else did a big piece on that today.
Yeah.
That's the trend. It's not, it's not that Trump's getting more votes, it's that a lot of Biden voters
Biden voters
did not show up.
And I know this is something that you were looking at too, Lisa, just this idea of turnout. So what does this tell you? What does it tell you about the state, and potentially what does it tell you about future elections?
Well, I was saying to you that I think a partial reason why I think there was lower turnout from, between 2020 and 2024 was that it was easier to vote in 2020. I mean, we were in a pandemic. It was easier to vote in Connecticut. Now the state has, for the first time, it had in-person early voting. Now it's approved no excuse absentee voting. And so I am curious to see what happens going forward in the state if, basically turnout gets boosted because people are just having an easier time of voting. But I think it's exactly what Mark said. I mean, I think people just had less of a reason on the Democratic side to come out and vote. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I don't know, kind of to Colin's point when we were talking about of wanting to conceal more that you were a Trump voter in Connecticut, I don't know. I mean, I was out here covering things in the last, final weeks run up, and people seemed more willing to talk about that. I don't know necessarily that people were hiding. I mean, I'd spoken with the GOP chairman in the state, and it was an anecdotal point, but he was saying that compared to 2016, they had all this excess Trump signs that they couldn't, lawn signs that they basically couldn't get people to take, and then they were having people call them, being like, "Are you going to order more?" And so, I mean, at the time, very anecdotal. Don't want to, not a data point, but I think now that we've seen how this has all turned out, people were more willing to vote for him and be out there.
We've talked about this a lot over the years, and yes, it may not be true data, but when you start seeing a bunch of lawn signs, it actually does say something. It actually means something, doesn't it?
Well, it's funny because the whole business about would local Republican organizations have Trump signs, that was the source of a coup of sorts in Greenwich among the Republicans. There were the Trump group that were furious that the Republicans in Greenwich did not have Trump signs available. That group took over, and the party went really hard right in Greenwich. Greenwich, the birthplace of the Bush Klan. And there was a counter reaction where the moderates took control again and nominated, they were slightly more successful who they nominated. But I remember in 20 being in Ridgefield where there was an open race, a guy named John Fry, who's still a Republican National Committee member. And Ridgefield was one of those Fairfield County towns that was kind of teetering. So I thought it would be interesting to go down and spend time. And I followed the Democrat around door to door, which is great exercise in Ridgefield, Connecticut, by the way. You get a lot of steps in. But when I went to interview her Republican opponent at their headquarters, he noted that there were no Trump signs because he used the word, it would be triggering in that town. So that was the sense in 2020 of really laying low, and that did change this time.
If I could just pause on the political analysis for just a second, since we were talking about early voting, how freaking cool was that? I mean, I don't know. So my wife and I were the very first people in the history of Winchester, Connecticut, to vote in the election early. We stood in line, and we were there with a bunch of people, and we were, as we saw people coming in, we're like, we know how they're voting. I'm not sure we know how they're voting. We know how they're voting. But it was interesting, and we're all sitting in a little room, and nobody in this room, including the election officials, knew what the hell they were doing. Like, no one knew how to do this, and we were all kind of figuring it out together. I don't know, Colin, you and I have talked about this for years, about just like trying to make this easier for people. It seemed to work this time. Wasn't this a good thing?
Yeah, well, Paz and I voted in West Hartford, and West Hartford's whole, vibe is we'd rather be proficient than exciting. So, like, they're really good at this. We didn't go on the first day, but when we went, it was just clockwork. I mean, they absolutely knew how to do this. You never felt any uncertainty. You knew exactly where to go because they told you to go over to the sign that says 4. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a great thing. I think for a long time we've had conversations, you and I, John, have had conversations about should Election Day be a national holiday so more people can vote, or should it be on Saturday? But this is better, letting people vote on lots of days.
It's letting people vote on lots of days, but to your point, though, Lisa, it seemed to help in some ways with getting turnout, but it didn't really help the Democrats in a whole lot of places that it could have.
It didn't. And I mean, frankly, both parties are really talking about early voting this time around. I mean, you looked at Trump and Republicans in 2020, and they were very, nervous around and skittish around mail-in ballots. And I mean, they think they saw how that worked out, is that when you're discouraging people from voting, people might not vote, and they might not be able to vote on Election Day or want to vote at all. So, I mean, I think both parties took advantage of that, which is why I think maybe it didn't help one party over the other. But, yeah, I mean, all around, definitely.
But it didn't help turnout overall.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense. I was going around the weekend before, and in tiny Burlington, they were doing a box office business on the weekend, and the first selectman pointed out that they only have one polling place. So in presidential years, you can wait in line for a really long time in this little town. So he just thought this was great. And he's a Republican. He said, my party has been slow to embrace this, but he said, we're there. But, Trump in 2020 hurt his own cause badly by casting such doubts on absentee voting, which was in vogue all around the country. And he infuriated county Republican executives all over this country who have had great AB get out the vote efforts. So, yeah, that kind of went away this time. Mr. Trump tweeted or X'd, whatever the new term of art is, several times in support of voting by AB or early voting and whatever's available.
As we talk about the turnout being low amongst Democrats, about people not being enthusiastic, I know something, Lisa, you've been looking at is just, what exactly connected with people and didn't connect with people around the message that the Democratic Party had. And this is about the Harris-Walz ticket at the top, but it does in some ways extend down through the levels of the Democratic Party. What did you hear from people in terms of the message and what people did or didn't get?
I think we're still going through the postmortem of what did or didn't work. We saw people like, Senator Chris Murphy's kind of been analyzing it and saying, hey, maybe Bernie Sanders is right. Maybe we should be focusing more on economic populism. But, at least in our, we had our own poll, the Connecticut Mirror, and I mean, what people cared about most in the state, I mean, that tracked nationally. I mean, big party breakdown and Democrats supporting, being nervous about threats to democracy or the future of democracy and abortion rights. Republicans sided more with economic and immigration issues. And I mean, that held up. Those were the issues. The Republican side, that's what people wanted. That's what people wanted to focus on. And so I think Democrats just didn't maybe message around that properly. Definitely a disconnect on that. And I mean, it's not like they didn't talk about it, but they didn't quite, even in states like Missouri, Senator Chris Murphy pointed this out the day after. They voted to raise the minimum wage in a state like Missouri. Missouri was not going to be won by Democrats. No Democrats were going to win that statewide. So, I mean, again, disconnect on the policy that maybe the Democrats support, but yet Democrats not being able to.
So real quick, I want to get to Colin. What do you make of this, Colin? I mean, just this huge disconnect between what the Democrats were saying this time, what they were asking people to vote for, and then what people actually cared about. Because, you know, a lot of exit polls did show people do care about threats to democracy. They seem to care about the price of eggs a little bit more.
Yeah, and it's not going to be one thing, right? We're gonna see that it's 8 different things. I actually think you can't discount the fact that people, not probably people in this room, people really like Donald Trump, and they feel like he's their guy, and he's going to try to solve their problems. And you can see some weird stuff, like in Nevada, there were 60,000 ballots cast where the voter just voted for Trump and went home. You know, they didn't vote down ballot. You know, and you look at a place like Arizona, which we think of as a pretty conservative place. Gallego carries Arizona. The abortion rights ballot measure carries. It carried. I think abortion rights carried in Missouri. I mean, like super red states. So that's kind of generally true too. If you put something that kind of tracks as maybe a Democratic issue, raising the minimum wage or like, you know, something like that as a ballot measure, it does really well even in states that are going to vote for conservative candidates. So there is a little bit of a disconnect between policy and who people want as their person. And to me, you know, one of the big questions that I have is Trump a one-off? Like, what happens if he dies 2 years into his presidency, or what happens in the next cycle, where probably it's going to be J.D. Vance and one of Trump's horrible sons as his running mate, you know, trying to create a dynasty. Is this just a thing where there's this guy who has magic dust that we can't quite understand? Because it's not just that. Let me just say one more thing, which is, Paz, you know, you have much better grasp of this than I do, but, you know, I think we're all kind of acknowledged, there was a rightward track even here in Connecticut. And like on election night at 7 o'clock, I was talking to a very well-networked Republican who thought Tony Huang and Ryan Fazio were toast. I mean, a lot of Republicans thought, we're going to lose those 2 Senate seats. Well, that turned out not to be the case for some of the reasons that we've already talked about up here. But you can't really ascribe that to Trump, I don't think. There was something else going on that I think is harder to pin down.
Yeah, Pass.
Well, to say there's no one thing will be the understatement of the night and the week and the year. Because when it comes to assessing, you know, Mr. Trump's support, I mean, I'll go back to a rally I covered in 2016 where, you know, Trump had some major events in Connecticut, and one of them was in Waterbury. And the great thing about being a reporter at a Trump rally is it fills up quickly, you know. And so you have an hour and a half to roam around a large auditorium talking to people about what brought them here, as opposed to a lot of times political rallies, you're grabbing people on their way out the door and you get some glib quote. But I had an hour and a half to have long conversations with a real broad variety of people, many of whom had voted for Barack Obama in 2012. And, you know, the polling tells us that's not an insignificant cohort. So, you know, what conclusions can you draw from that? These are people who wanted change. They wanted something different. In Waterbury that day, I interviewed a teacher who was a registered Democrat who had run for office as a Democrat and just was so hungry for something different. So there's...
Paz, did you encounter the thing, because I encountered this at a 2016 Trump rally, where their second favorite person in play was Bernie? A lot of Trump voters,
exactly.
They said, if it's not going to be Trump, we'd like Bernie. Well, how could they be further apart?
But that was the point that Chris Murphy was making, is that, you know, talking about maybe Democrats focusing on populism. And I mean, that was a thing in 2016, the kind of this Bernie to Trump pipeline. Same thing with Obama to Trump pipeline, and for different reasons. But
I'd like to ask, that's really interesting. And Chris Murphy, I think we can all agree, we've all talked with him a number of times, and he's a very smart person. But, you know, focusing on populism, what the hell does that mean? Like, what are we talking about? What exactly is he asking for the Democrats to do differently to focus on populism?
There's a conversation that's going on right now in Connecticut about what that means. And the context for that is, what should the legislature undertake? Come back. And, I'm working on a story right now. It's a variation of stories that have been done elsewhere, but it's not just how the urban turnout fell. I'm looking at it in the context of the gubernatorial election 2 years ago. Ned Lamont won his first term in 2018 in a 50-50 kind of race, conventional kind of Democratic coalition support. And then 2022, he wins, by Connecticut standards, a landslide. But it was a suburban landslide. The city vote for him was awful. I mean, he won the cities. He won all the cities the same way Kamala Harris did. So I'm now sitting here in Connecticut saying, is there a specific Connecticut story about the Democratic Party kind of not at odds, but failing to excite the Democratic base in the cities? And look, the two biggest easy, lazy predictors of voter turnout are education levels and income levels. And in the cities, you tend to be on the short end with those two indicators a lot. So it takes work to explain to voters why they should turn out. You talked about there's no one thing about Trump. Well, there's no one thing here, right? In the cities, there's really no competition, right? There are a lot of unopposed races, so there's that. But then there's also this discussion right now of, has the Democratic Party in Connecticut, is it too focused on fiscal responsibility of dealing with that gargantuan pension debt that this governor has been concerned with, and for good reason. But, there's a debate that we're going to have in the coming session about the fiscal guardrails. Are they too tight? Has the General Assembly and this governor sort of lost touch with some of the needs of the Democratic coalition?
Lisa, before you go, Lisa, one thing that I think about with all this, and you would have a better grasp of it than I do, if you just tease out all of the stuff that was the Biden presidency, it looks pretty fucking populist to me, The stuff that's in the infrastructure bill, he's walking on picket lines. I mean, I think he was just policy-wise probably kind of a very populist president. He just wasn't plausibly populist for some reason. But I think it has something to do with presentation as much as it has to do with the substance of what you do.
No, I think that's exactly it. I think something, again, with the messaging just wasn't quite there. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. I mean, they're talking about the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, these are massive bills, especially the Inflation Reduction Act. There's so much in there. And so when you're just saying these multi-billion, even trillion bills that do, a little bit on climate, a little bit on healthcare, just parsing that out for what that means for people. I mean, sometimes, I would hear Kamala Harris or, in Connecticut, Johanna Hayes or Chris Murphy talk about capping insulin at $35 a month, doing basically Medicare being able to negotiate drug prices. I mean, those are tangible, real things that are already happening, that people are seeing and feeling in their pocketbooks, or that will happen in the near future. I just don't think they were talking about it enough. They were, maybe weren't packaging it.
Bruce,
right?
was it bad that I said a bad word on the live stream? Is that a problem?
It's actually a live stream, so we can say whatever we want, but it just makes him very uncomfortable. He's a very traditional type of publisher. But I think that
We're
there's
going to have a big finish, Bruce, too.
I think that there's obviously something to that. I wanted to tell a little story of somebody that I ran into. He might even be here tonight for all I know. He's a middle-aged white guy that I know who reads the Connecticut Mirror, listens to public radio, came up to me the day after the election, wanted to start talking to me about politics, and he said, look, I'm a Republican, but I'm not MAGA. He said that like 5 times to me. Republican, not MAGA. And I voted for Kamala Harris because I couldn't stomach voting for Donald Trump. But there's something about her campaign, and there's something about the Democrats right now that are not speaking to me. They're not speaking to the things I care about. They're not speaking to the issues I care about. They're not speaking to me in a way that matters to me. So there's two different sides of my brain. There's the political science journalism side of my brain that says, yeah, okay, well, he's saying something interesting that I should be listening to and that maybe we should think more about. And there's the other side of my brain that was saying, oh my God, another white guy saying that we need to listen to him when we've been listening to white men tell us what to do for 3,000 years, right? And so I guess I'm wondering how much of it is just that. Some people, just didn't feel like they were getting talked to, whether it was by Kamala Harris or by down-ticket Democrats. They feel like there's something, as Chris Murphy said, that's just not there that's touching them. And how much do the Democrats need to, like, start listening in a different way?
All right, I'm going to step out in the tightrope without a net now and talk about wokeness. I'm not going to go too far on the tightrope, so Bruce, don't worry. It was a factor in the campaign. Donald Trump did a masterful job of defining the Democrats as more concerned about transgender assignment surgery in penal or in prisons. Shouldn't have said penal. Sorry.
Shouldn't have said that.
Once again, Bruce, we apologize.
All right. Anyway, that was an actual line, and that was an actual ad that the Trump campaign did. And the problem with that for the Democrats, as soon as you start to say, well, I'm not that woke. Oh, that doesn't work. Well, I'm really not that concerned about transgender kids. Oh, that doesn't work. And that was part of the dynamic. And again, as Colin said at the beginning, and we'll say over and over again, it wasn't just one thing. But that was part of it, that John's friend may have felt, why am I hearing too much about a really tiny minority that deserves protections, but why are we talking about that? The other element is perception, narratives. In journalists, we like to talk about it in campaigns. Once a narrative is established, it's kind of hard to change it. And Donald Trump would say over and over and over and over and over again that crime is out of control. And crime in this country is not out of control. And in fact, if you look at the statistics over the decades, it's been falling pretty steadily. Now there are up spikes, car thefts in Connecticut, for example. But those statistics don't hit people the same way a security video of a guy walking out of Walmart with a cart full of stuff he didn't pay for. And that, the security is they're told not to confront and whatever. The street takeovers, right? Good example. It gives the sense of lawlessness that the statistics really say is not true.
It's not true.
But it doesn't mean it doesn't make that impact. I mean, the commissioner of public safety in Connecticut had to wait to pick up his daughter because of a street takeover. He's the guy who commands the Connecticut State Police. And the spectacle of troopers standing by when this is going on makes an impact. And the impact of the fact that those troopers were recording all those license plates and were later making a lot of arrests, that kind of gets lost. It doesn't have the same emotional impact.
Colin, I would love to have your thoughts on this, because I think this is just, these ideas that get ingrained, whether or not they're through television ads or is just through people hearing about it. I mean, I think that my friend who I'm talking about, it's not that he heard Democrats talking about some issues that he didn't care that much about. It's that he heard Republicans talking about how Democrats care about it, whether or not Democrats talk about it all that much. And I think it's a new way of campaigning. It's a new way of thinking about political discourse, and it actually seemed to matter this time.
I think the problem's way deeper. I'm getting ready this week to interview this guy, Brian Reed, who did S-Town, and he's got a new podcast out called Question Everything, is that what it's called? And if you would like to scare the crap out of yourself, listen to the interview that he did with a guy named Barton Gellman, who's one of the superstars of the Atlantic, who quit journalism. And he's now working for the Brennan Center. And he walks through this experience he had where he picked a guy connected to the January 6th thing, a firefighter, who seemed like a nice, reasonable guy, and asked him a lot of questions. And then for everything that the guy said, Gelman went back and in the kind of very painstaking fact-based journalism that the Connecticut Mirror does so well, found out the truth and brought it back, and in just once again with a lot of clarity laid it out for this guy. And this happens several times. And each time the guy said, no, I don't buy that. One of the things that he believed turned out to be a Rumble video made by a retired general who Gelman interviewed, and then the son came over and said, my dad has dementia. I hope you're not going to be using this in the Atlantic. It was stuff like that. But it didn't make any difference to the firefighter because he'd already kind of made his decision about these things. And I'll just quickly say, this is a very quick old guy story, but Paz and I covered the impeachment
Another
hearings.
old guy.
Yeah, the impeachment hearings for John Rowland. And this was a House Select Committee hearing, a House Select Committee that was Republican and Democrat. And we watched, and it started out, most of the Republicans, maybe all the Republicans, they just weren't going to freaking do this. It was like Arthur O'Neill and Bill Hamsey and all those guys. And we watched over a period of days where one by one, you could sort of see the light blink on, one by one. They were like, oh, wow, this is worse than I realized, because they were absorbing evidence and it was literally changing their minds. I think that almost isn't happening anymore, or it's happening so rarely. People have their priors, and you can't move them off that. And it doesn't make any difference what kind of facts you present to them, which is very scary for us as a society. It's scary for us as a profession. The work that you're doing, may not move people in the way that you hope it will.
I would love to get your thoughts on that, Lisa, too, because I think that we get into journalism thinking, well, if we just tell people, the stuff that's true, then they'll take that stuff that's true and act accordingly. And when that doesn't happen, it's like, I won't say what I was going to say, are we doing here? And I'm wondering how that strikes you as the token non-old white guy on the stage.
No, it's tough. I mean, you look at something like January 6th, and it's like the country can't even agree upon what that was or what happened. And so it's like we're all working from different facts and different points of view. And so, I mean, I thought personally ticket splitting was kind of dead. I thought at this point everyone just basically, and it's true, that still holds up. Most people just, vote top of the ticket and they keep going down. I think that largely happened. But to your point earlier, I mean, there were swing states that Trump carried that Democrats still carried. They carried a lot of Senate seats in swing states. So, I mean, there's still, for whatever reason, people were kind of going on a little bit of vibes this time and how people made them feel. But, I think when you go further down the ballot, wouldn't call a Senate candidate super local, but I think campaigns and candidates do matter. And the more local you go, the more people feel potentially connected to them, or like they're speaking, a certain issue to them. And so I do think that's the challenge when you get, at the top of the ticket. But
Could I ask you briefly to talk about the 5th district race, which you covered quite a bit? This is Johanna Hayes' seat. It was set to be the one of the congressional races that was potentially a troublesome race for the Democrats. What did you make of the outcome there, and what about that race was, informed by the race at the top of the ticket between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump?
Something I'm still waiting on is I want to know the presidential election by congressional district, because I am, again, curious to see if people like Johanna Hayes or other, incumbents outperformed the top of the ticket. I'm curious to see that. But, it wasn't too surprising. She was poised to have an easier time, Democrats overall, because it is a presidential election year, still a very tough race. So wasn't too surprised there. But, a point I was making to you is I think one of the biggest differences, you see at top of the ticket versus maybe some of these down ballot races is she was confronted with a lot of tough votes that she had to take, one of them being a House vote on a fentanyl bill. And it was in all the ads. I think it raised a lot of eyebrows. I'm sure a lot of people still voted against her based on even hearing her explanation, but she had said that would lead to potential more incarceration, and she had seen what happened with the 1994 crime bill. And so she was at least willing to talk about tough votes she had to take, talk about tough issues. I think that was a little bit of a deficit for Democrats at the top of the ticket. I mean, we talked about that earlier, Harris having to explain comments and past votes and positions she had taken when she had run in 2020, and she deflected. I feel like we never really got an answer on why she had moved, changed her position. And so, I think that was an interesting kind of deviation that I saw, at least down ballot versus top of the ticket, and that was certainly the case.
And Johanna Hayes learned to be a congresswoman and a candidate. She was very much a work in progress her first run, where Chris Murphy had really recruited her, and her big experience in dealing with the media was as a National Teacher of the Year. She's, in my view, she's come a long way as a politician, as somebody who knows how to make her points. The vote Lisa's talking about, she said it was a mandatory minimum sentencing, and that was a huge mistake. And she would turn it to her favor and say, I knew it would be a gotcha vote. I knew it would be in an ad, and I still voted that way. And you kind of go, well, good for you, lady. I mean, whether you agree or disagree with her, but it was genuine. It was authentic. Whereas Kamala Harris still hasn't explained, I don't think, her position on fracking, for example. So anyway, authenticity.
Which is a hard thing to do in my home state of Pennsylvania,
yes,
to not have a position on fracking. Yeah.
I mean, I think she was also helped with the fact that Logan actually ran probably a worse campaign this time than he did last time. She kind of more professionalized her campaign, brought some people in who kind of maybe knew how to, talk to Lisa or, don't talk to Dan Haar, things like that. That was a joke.
It's a small Dan Haar joke. Is Dan here today? Oh, damn it. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
By the way, Danny did a great job this time. Danny really went out in the neighborhoods and talked to people. Yes. That Hartford piece of his was terrific. It pains me to say it, but he did a really great job. But I feel like Hayes did. She professionalized her campaign. She learned from her mistakes. Logan is like increasing like this kind of Zelig-like figure. You see his picture, but you can't really figure out anything about him. It's like he's determined to have people know nothing about him. It's a hard way to run.
No, a good example of that. If to win as a Republican in this state, you need to have a bit of an identity as I'm a slightly different Republican. I'm an independent-minded Republican. So at his nominating convention, he took a couple of really good shots at the Biden administration over the southern border. Fair enough. So that invited me to immediately ask him, so how would you have voted on the bipartisan compromise border bill that Chris Murphy did with Senator Langford and Senator Sinema, an independent and a Republican? And Logan, well, I don't know. There were things and I just thought, you haven't learned. I mean, it was an opportunity to get a headline that said, Logan distances himself from Trump. Because at the moment, remember, Trump had submarined that bill by telling Republicans stay away from it because he wanted the border issue to be alive during the campaign.
And it was.
And Logan could have taken that position, and trust me, Trump wasn't going to come here and drop a house on him. At that point, he is the nominee, the de facto nominee. And it would have helped George Logan, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it because it would have meant, in a gentle way, distancing himself from Donald Trump, and he was either unable or unwilling to do that.
Well, and also in putting himself slightly closer to Chris Murphy, who was really one of the key architects of that piece of legislation.
Also James Langford.
Yeah. So to that point, I'll come to you first, Lisa, but this is something that we used to talk about on the program all the time. So there's a Republican move in cities and towns. It's not a big move. Obviously, Democrats still hold all these congressional seats. But you'd think by this point that the Republican Party could start to put up some candidates for some of these congressional races. Is there something now with maybe this movement toward Trump, maybe something in Trumpism itself that maybe is appealing to people that suggests to you that the Republican Party is ready to start actually competing to get congressional seats and maybe even the governor's office back again?
Yeah, I mean, 5th District was really the only game in town. And
Yeah.
so I realize that party building in that way, building a bench of candidates, that's tough because, you know, you have to field people in the 1st district against John Larson, who is just, you know, he's just not going to lose until basically he wants to leave, and then there'll be a big primary for that. But I mean, they fielded candidates like Jim Griffin in the 1st, former Democrat, but who had a lot of conspiracy theories. And so, again, it's not like Jim Griffin was going to win that seat, but they're definitely, I'm curious to see maybe a longer term conversation of what does party building look like. And I mean, 5th district again, still one of the only games in town. Yeah, you had someone like George Logan running again.
Who didn't necessarily live there.
That's also true. Yeah.
I'm calling you laughing again. We've talked about this a lot over the years. I mean, is there a chance that the Republican Party starts to think about putting up candidates? Because I don't know, if there's a rightward move in the cities, if there's a rightward move across the board in the country, you'd think that maybe there's an opportunity here to pick up a seat.
Well, look, the Democrats were really full of themselves regarding the state Senate races. They were telling me with all confidence, we're going to take 4 Republican seats, maybe even 5. And the line I remember is, when we get done with them, they're not going to have enough people to field a baseball team, right? They would go from 12 to 8 or maybe even 7.
That seems like the sort of line you rehearse before you tell a reporter.
This person may have. But, you know, the only seat they picked up was in the Farmington Valley, Lisa Seminar, who's a freshman in that part of the state.
And that was like 200 votes the last time, too. It was incredibly close.
It was very close. Yeah. There were 4 Republican state senators who won 2 years ago with less than 51% of the vote, and there was 1 Democrat, Mae Flexer, out in eastern Connecticut. But UConn's in her district, and she always does much better in presidential years because, you know, as they did this year, they'll bus 1,000 UConn students to town hall and register them that day, which is perfectly legal, and that's what they did, although there's a complaint that was filed today suggesting it was untoward.
You can read about it in the Connecticut Mirror, just even right now, as a matter of fact.
So for the Republicans, they were desperate for something to organize around. They were hoping it would be a congressional seat. But saving Ryan Fazio, who's a 35-year-old young guy who had clawed back a seat that had been lost in Greenwich, I mean, that was big for them, for him to win again, because he won twice in a special, and then in 22 he won with 50.1% of the vote. And he had a Democrat who spent a boatload of money, and even though he had Trump on the ballot next to Ryan Fazio very much outperformed Donald Trump down there. So there's that. But what they need is then, how do you build on it? You know, Connecticut General Assembly's terms, these are 2-year terms. So if you get them to go for something else, you're risking a seat. Now, the Democrats have never had any problem. I mean, people, even in the Republican Party, will quietly admire Chris Murphy because his whole career is pushing all the chips to the center of the table. You know, he was a state rep. He went for a state Senate seat. By the way, he didn't live in that district either when he ran for it. And then he ran for Congress against Nancy Johnson. Thought it might be a 2-cycle endeavor to take her out. He wins, and then he immediately goes for the open Senate seat. So, you know, the Democrats have a deeper bench and a bench of people who are willing to take chances.
But I think there's a couple of things about that are worth noting, too. First of all, on the congressional end, in the 1st and the 3rd, that's Larson and Rosa, if you're the Republican, you're basically the goat that they stake out for the Tyrannosaurus in Jurassic Park. You know, the tourists just want to watch the Tyrannosaurus eat something. You know, it's going to be you. It's just not a great job. You know, but like, think about the 2nd, all right? So the 2nd is Eastern Connecticut. And people think it's a little redder than I think it really is. I mean, Stefanowski took it in 2018, but other than that, it's not. It's pretty blue. And Joey Courtney, he's been there a long time now, and people really know him and stuff. So 2 years ago, they have a guy named Mike Franz. He runs against Courtney. He loses by, I think, 18 points. So what they thought is, let's run Mike again. He lost by 18 points. You have to move on. And so he ran this time, and he lost by 16 points. That's what Trump was worth to him, is 2 points.
So, by the way, if You know, because I know people make bar bets all the time on who got the most votes in Connecticut congressional races. Any guesses as to who got the most votes in Connecticut? Joe Courtney. Yeah. And I'm looking at it and trying to figure what the hell happened. And all I could come up with is there are no major urban centers in that district. And he had like 212 or 218,000 votes. And it was more, and in a, you know, he did not have the highest percentage, but he had the raw vote. Courtney had the most.
The other thing I wanted to say is that it's a problem on the Democratic side, too, in the following sense. Yes, the Democrats have a good bench. They've been sitting in a waiting room for years and years and years because Larson doesn't go and DeLauro doesn't go. And now Courtney and Himes are pretty much, you know, they're kind of moving into that. Although Himes actually, you probably know what Himes wants. He wants something else, wants to be senator or something. But, you know, it's hard. It's hard to be Luke Bronin or Susan Beisowitz or William Tong or, I mean, you know, I mean, if you want to do something else, if you want to move up and nobody moves and they can't ever lose their election, the seat isn't going to open up that way. And that's sort of not good for morale. And I think it also means that new ideas don't get into the pipeline.
Oh, yeah, the amount of incumbency in the delegation. I mean, that comes with seniority, but, I mean, they've, not to super date myself, but Rosa DeLauro has been in office 1 year longer than I've been alive. So, I mean, to put that in context, they've been, you know, it's been, and hey, she has a lot of...
And I covered her first campaign. and my youngest child was born on Election Day when she was reelected in 1992.
Oh my goodness. We're running low on time, and so I just want to get some final thoughts. And Lisa, I'll start with you. What are the things that you're looking at now? Okay, you have got to look forward, and Lord knows, those of us in our business have been spending a lot of time thinking about, okay, what stories are we going to try to follow? What is it about the Trump administration? What is it about the congressional delegation? What's happening at the state legislature? What are some things that you're focusing on and thinking about right now?
Yeah, and the more immediacy before the end of the year. I mean, they're back in town, Congress, for the lame duck, so there's just going to be even more of an urgency for Democrats to try to get whatever they can done. Can that happen in that short period of time? I don't know. There's the holidays coming up. They basically have to fund the government. So, you know, there's that. And then they're probably going to try to confirm a lot of judicial nominations, but there's a lot sitting around for Democratic priorities in the Connecticut delegation. There's the Kids Online Safety Act from Senator Blumenthal. The Farm Bill is a big thing. That is technically lapsed right now. They need to be able to figure out if they need to fund that for the next 5 years. So there's a lot sitting and waiting. I don't know how much they can get done, but that's going to be my main focus is what gets basically left on the cutting room floor, what can pass in a lame duck.
But truly, and they do have to get this stuff done. I mean, this is going to be their last gasp for some time.
Yeah, I mean, government funded, that has to get funded. They have up until mid-December. So, but yeah, I mean, again, priorities that are not mandatory that they're going to try to get through. So, yeah, because come January, it's probably going to be uniform Republican control. And so anything that the Democrats in Connecticut or elsewhere want to get done, now's their time.
Yeah. Paz, how about you? What are you looking at?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at the General Assembly and how that tees up 2026. There is a Trump connection there because the mayor of New Britain, Aaron Stewart, a Republican already, is sounding very much like a candidate for the Republican nomination. But hanging over her head is, will Donald Trump take an interest in who the Republican nominee for governor is in Connecticut, the way he did in the U.S. Senate race more 2 years ago when he endorsed Leora Levy over Themis Claridis, and that is not helpful in this state. As far as policies and issues, I think the thing we'll be looking at in Connecticut is the extent to which Trump follows through on his promises to do mass deportations. Sanctuary state has no legal meaning, but Connecticut generally is regarded as something of a sanctuary state because of certain laws that have been passed here and do have meaning about how children are treated and whatnot. And if President Trump, who already has named a bunch of immigration hardliners to his administration, if they really go to war in that regard, that could be the dominant story in Connecticut, I think, for the first year of the Trump administration.
In terms of how Connecticut cooperates or does not cooperate with federal immigration officials?
No, absolutely. And, you know, William Tong already has talked about the firewall that Democratic attorneys, state attorneys generals have raised. But that could be, and again, if Trump does this, the question is, do you want this to be the dominant story? Because if you think back to the first term with the separation of children from parents, which was done, I think, objectively in a punitive way to send the message across the border, don't come here, we'll take your children. If that unfolds, that, in my view, will become the dominant story of the first year of the Trump administration, and we won't even notice the disappearance of the EPA.
There's that. Colin, how about you? What are you looking at?
I'll just sort of keep it Connecticut as well, and just say, first of all, I said at the beginning, it really matters who's governor of Connecticut now more than ever, because states are going to have to do some of the things that the federal government will stop doing. I think, it's just so you know, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but the last I knew, Ned was still telling everybody he's going to seek a third term, which I don't get. You know, I really don't. Like, it's like Jay Gatsby saying, I think I'd like to run for Board of Assessors instead of having, like, really big parties. But anyway, and Ned has indicated, as far as I know, that, you know, he's probably going to run again, in which case he should definitely hire a food taster, because Susan Beisowitz has been waiting a long time for this opportunity. If he doesn't run, it kind of opens the field up to some of the people we talked about before. There are a lot of people who want to do stuff, who want to run for higher office. One person that I didn't mention, keep your eye on Caroline Simmons. Caroline Simmons, mayor of Stamford. Stamford casts more votes by far than any other municipality in Connecticut. It's like not close. It's like if they cast 58,000 votes in an election, the next one's 42,000. Stamford is big. Caroline Simmons also comes from kind of an interesting background. She's married to a former Republican politician from the Linares family, and they're very good at raising money. And, I just think she's somebody you keep an eye on if Ned doesn't run. Over on the Republican side, they have a real problem, which Paz just alluded to. I mean, their nomination process just really sucks. What happens is you have a primary in August, and just to give the Leora Levy Themis Claridis thing as an example, I think 46,000 people, something like that, voted in that primary to see who's going to run against Dick Blumenthal, who can collect somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million votes in a cycle. So 46,000 people, you know, a little bit more than half of that is going to pick somebody to run against Blumenthal. And so what you might have in the next cycle is maybe Themis wants to run for that, maybe Aaron Stewart wants to run for that, maybe Heather Bond Summers wants to run for that. Stefanowski is making noises about the idea maybe he's going to run again. This is seeming more and more like a zombie movie where, like, nobody will die. And, you know, then you have a guy like Rob Sampson, who's a true MAGA kind of guy. And if the equation that Paz just talked about, where Trump endorses somebody, and particularly if you have a crowded field, that person just vaults ahead, you know, in this pretty small primary election. So the thing that I'm wondering about is one of those people going to consider branching out and starting a third party or a Connecticut for Lieberman, a Connecticut Party Weicker kind of thing, just to get out of that? Because the primary is a killer, you know? The primary really favors the most extreme candidate, who is not the most electable candidate in Connecticut. So if that happens, it'll be really a lot of fun for us anyway.
But meanwhile, as you're looking at all that, you're going to be focusing on your program on art and life and fun and things that aren't.
Oh, yeah. We're doing a whole week of shows about Kerry Russell, so you know, that's going to be good.
And Colin is aware, by the way, that Joe Lieberman and Lowell Weicker are dead.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were kind of instrumental in the ability to get.
But remember
a
what
third
happened was Lieberman never registered with Connecticut for Lieberman. And then these guys who were it was John Orman and people, these guys who were way to the left of Lieberman, they just took over the party because nobody was taking care of it. And they got that ballot line and they ran candidates who would make Lieberman want to puke. So be careful if you start a third party. Take care of it afterwards. Take it to the car wash once in a while. Have it tuned up.
Ladies and gentlemen, the great Colin McEnroe. Lisa Hagen, federal policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public. Mark Pazniokas, the Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. I want to thank you all so much for being here. I just have to thank a couple people. Thank you to Real Artways for hosting this event. Thanks to Will Wilkins and Lauren Bolstridge for helping to coordinate this event. Thank you to the great Helder Mira for handling the live stream. Thanks to our Connecticut Mirror team, Bruce Putterman, Elizabeth Hamilton, Chris Nilsson, Claire Dignan, Irene Mackey, Gabby DeBenedictis, and Brianna Nelson, who put this event together. Big hand for Brianna as well. One last thing to say. So next week, next Wednesday at the Hartford Public Library, I'll be doing one of our regular conversations, as I said before, with Susan Beisowitz. It's called In the Room. I think now I'm going to invite Colin to come with me. I think she'd really appreciate that. You can find out more at ctmirror.org/events. Drive home safe, folks. Have a good night.
Thursday. It's really fun. And it's hot, too. I mean, I don't know.